Greetings, nerds. So, a question of my last video popped up in my Discord. If you're not in the Discord, there's a link in the description. But it was whether or not the grind size of pigments altered the opacity or not. And this has a lot to do with gouache. The last video wasn't targeting mini painters, really. It was more targeting gouache people who keep saying that high pigmentation gouache leads to opacity when that's not the case. It has to have other adulterants in there like titanium white, chalk, bentonite, kaolin, things like that. When in reality, there's a lot that goes into making paint opaque, and it's never as simple as just this one thing. Couple things to keep in mind about chalk, bentonite, kaolinite, things like that, is that they're mostly inert, so they don't actually impart too much color into your mixture, which is why they get used so often in gouache specifically, and why they get so used in things like uh, acrylics for opacifiers. In oils, they are transparent. In acrylics and watercolors, they are opaque. That is a huge thing to remember as well, because they are used constantly in oil paints to extend a pigment. For instance, you can find certain things like Michael Harding might use chalk in their phthalo pigment because you doing a pure phthalo pigment is going to actually be problematic in oil paint, is going to be near unusable. So they might use a little bit of chalk to extend that pigment out, give the paint more body, while also having a usable paint. That's something to keep in mind. Now, a lot of companies, especially gouache companies, will lie to you saying that they don't use any fillers like that. They just use pigments. Well, here's a trick. Chalk is a pigment. I believe it's PW18. Uh, but yeah, it's a pigment itself. So this is one little kind of trick where, yeah, they're not lying. Well, kaolin and bentonite are also pigments. They're filler pigments. So saying that they're not using any fillers, like, you know, this Minusil, which is a matte agent, this is a filler. This is non-pigment filler. Yeah, then that would be accurate. And it just comes from high pigmentation. But if we go with a high quality paint like Turner acrylic gouache, let me go grab the thing here of it. I just dropped everything. The transparent colors are going to be using a lot of chalk, around 46% from what I can tell by their Japanese MSDS. Their Japanese MSDS is really good, by the way. Japanese MSDSs typically force you to put a lot more information than any other country for transparency reasons, I believe. But yeah, a lot of their things are going to be around 46%, and this is considered one of the best gouaches on the market by most gouache painters, for acrylic gouache, that is. Like this one right here only contains about 4% colored pigment, and it's still powerful. You don't need a lot of colored pigment to make a good paint. That's another kind of trick that a lot of people don't really understand, is that a colored pigment, especially a transparent one, is going to not need a lot of pigmentation. You only need around 4 to 5% for your PVC to get a good pigment, get a good paint for certain pigments. With quinacridones, you need to be a little bit higher, around 10 to 15%, due to their lower tint strength. With a lot of lower tint strength things, you need to have a higher pigmentation. But that's not what we're getting into here. We're getting into grind size. So, does grind size actually affect your transparency? And that is a yes. However, grind size also affects your chroma. So, a smaller grind size like a Hegman 8 is going to have higher chroma than a Hegman 1. Now, it doesn't affect your grind size doesn't affect the transparency all that much in most cases. This is a pigment sample PY3 from Mobe company. This is from Sennelier right here. And as you can see, they're really similar in terms of pigment size. This is going to be a little bit smaller, I believe. but this is still mostly unground. This is lemon yellow. This is their PY3 from a historic standard, but the aggregates and agglomerates in here are worse than that one is. But roughly they're equivalently the same size. And this is how pigments come out of the factory. This is when you buy a pigment like this is going to be very similar to a pigment sample. They're not really going to grind it down. They're not going to do anything to it. They're going to turn into a dispersion for their paint, which means grinding it down. But that's a different story. Now, when you grind things in a specific way, like with red iron oxide, you can get a transparent red iron oxide if you grind it down in a very specific way. But you're not doing this in your factory because it takes forever. And it's very, very complicated to do this. Very few companies I know will actually do this. They'll just go buy the transparent red iron oxide because it has to be a very specific type of crystalline structure for it to be transparent as well. And when you grind it down, the chroma goes up and the transparency goes down, up as well by a very little small margin. But it's not going to, it's, as I said, the crystalline structure of it has to be a very specific way for it to actually be transparent. So grinding this down to a Higman-8, grinding this down to a Higman-8, you're not going to have this one being more transparent. You're just going to have it being more colorful. You have to get it much smaller, much smaller than a Higman-8, which Higman-8 is really the smallest size, not the largest, the smallest size that you can calculate manually. You have to get all these like subatomic particle size analyzers, stuff like that, the really expensive equipment I don't have, to get that type of thing. Now, that's where it gets super complicated. Whether or not the particle size is causing paints to be opaque or not, right? When in reality, not really. They become a little bit more transparent, but you can overcome that by just adding a little bit more pigment and stuff like that. And you can still get a matte texture with a Higman-8 grind, stuff like that, which I'll show in a future video about matte paints that I'm working on, where you can still get that matte texture from a Higman-8 grind, and it's not hard to do, it's just tricky. Because you have to have enough pigmentation above the critical pigment volume concentration for it to be matte. Which is why when you see a matte paint, you're not going to have a matte paint have anything but fillers in them, simply because it doesn't make much economical sense and it doesn't make much sense as a whole. You're going to use something like this silica right here, a 30 micron silica. 30 microns is a reasonable particle size to where you're not really going to see it as grain, but it's going to give you that micro texture that matte paints are after. So, and you can grind that down, but you don't want to grind it down too much. It's things like this pyrogenic silica, pyrochloric silica, whatever you want to call it. It's mostly transparent, so it doesn't impart really any much color. It's just sand, effectively. Really, really fine sand. So hopefully this video was educational and helped you a fair bit understanding the previous video about high pigmentation. Yeah. Bye or something.